Okay. Actually, Jim, do you mind if I make a quick announcement, like about the reason for postponing the course and that what we've changed, just very general notes, and then it's all over to you. Да, уважаемые участники, доброе утро всем. Мы возобновляем курс по экспорту с Джимом, с Ашвином, и вот задержка в 2-3 недели, которая произошла, была связана в том числе и с вашими рекомендациями, где-то подправить структуру курса. Ну и сами мы пришли к определенным выводам. И вот с Джимом, посоветовавшись, мы решили немного изменить структуру и содержание. Больше стало сейчас видеоматериалов, больше материалов из других источников. Поэтому, думаю, и более практическая направленность появилась в презентациях с инструментами, с методиками для разработки экспортной стратегии, маркетингового плана и так далее. Поэтому с удовольствием передаю слово Джиму, и мы надеемся уже на новом, более углубленном уровне мы возобновляем этот курс. Но в то же время следует сказать, что первые две презентации, они были важны в плане подачи основ для консалтинговой деятельности в развитии экспорта, что и было предоставлено вам Джимом и Ашвином. Ну а дальше мы углубляемся в эти темы. Удачи всем, продуктивного тренинга, и передаю слово Джиму.
Great, thank you. I just want to make sure everybody can see my screen.
Yes, we can see
Perfect.
it.
Okay, we can see it and we're recording. I'm going to start today a little bit off script and talk briefly about the website for the International Digital University and how to navigate through it. I will send a link to the project with some of the YouTube videos that talk about how to do it, but I'll spend a couple of minutes here now talking about it. This is a landing page when you sign on. This is your course here, the export training for Turkmenistan. When you click on it, it takes you to, actually I'm set up here as the instructor, but it takes you to a page where there are a number of links here. From these links, you can click on, for example, a SWOT analysis YouTube video that we prepared and presented. You can click on the business plan development video. So some of the things that we cover here tonight in the PowerPoint course are based out of what we have here. And some of the things that we don't cover are here as well, because we have time restrictions on the PowerPoint, but we don't have time restrictions on the website. So this, clicking on these will allow you to take a look at the documents. For example, I clicked on the marketing document. This is the market access research keys to export trade support document. This is a document which we at 2020 use to solicit feedback, and we'll talk about that in the session. But by clicking on that link inside of the university, you can edit the document, you can download it, and it gives you access to the materials 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then we'll continue to add, you can see here that the additional courses will continue to add to it. There is a announcement here, and we sent earlier the pre-test, which allows us to kind of gauge where the students are at. And as you can see here, we have 36 students, and 2 of them are in progress in taking that test. The test is really geared toward exporters, not toward export consultants, but it'll help us gauge where you're at in that aspect. Like I say, I'll send some YouTube video links, and you can explore this site further. This is the link that you hit to get to us here. There's different introductions of our team members that you'll see throughout the courses. So we continue to put materials here as we add to the course. So I will go now to our PowerPoint and begin the PowerPoint show. Oh. Okay, so today, we talked about consulting, and we've changed the content of the course to be more geared toward helping consultants understand how to help their customers. And we're going to start with the enterprise audit. And we've talked about some of those tools already, and we'll cover them briefly today. We do have 87 slides today, and I don't know that we'll get through them all. But what's not covered here will be covered on the in the university. And mentorship is a critical point, because that is what the consultant ends up doing a lot of times, is providing the mentorship and the leadership, helping the companies improve. So we'll talk about some of those tools today. We'll talk about developing the product, but some of these courses are built to build upon each other. And earlier, the courses that we had on covering charm dance and business and entrepreneurial skills, we feel that is a critical foundation from which to build upon. These are all intertwined. Nothing stands alone. They all build upon each other and all relate back to each other. So it's kind of a house where you build the foundation, you end up with a roof. But in this case, they're all connected. And sometimes you get a piece of the roof while you're still working on the foundation. So we're trying to put these pieces together, and it takes some patience to understand where the course is going sometimes, but they all fit together. So the objective of this course upon completion, we talked in the past about T-charts and SWOT analysis. SWOT analysis is a good tool, and it's very broadly used. We'll cover that. We've covered it earlier, so we won't go into full depth on it, but we will touch upon it. One of the things that we always try to work with on exporters is to help them identify what business they are in. A good example of that is a friend of mine in Tajikistan produces boxes for the fruit industry. And when we started working with them, that was what they did, is they produced boxes for the fruit industry. And we sat down with them and said, well, really, what business are you in? And we were able to identify the fact that he was in the packaging business, not just for the fruit industry, but the materials, the equipment, the technology that he had could be used for packaging all goods. And it can be used for packaging food beyond the bulk packages that they were working with to some retail packaging. So, by stepping back and taking a look at the business, we really help them identify what business they're in. Too many times businesses feel they're in a business that things change. We always, here in the US, we use the example of the computer and the typewriter. The typewriter has disappeared because the typewriter manufacturers viewed themselves as being in the typewriter business, not in converting Word to paper. So they went out of business. So, by identifying their business in a broad scope, they were able to adjust. And the companies that adjust and are constantly adjusting, which is a Japanese concept of Kaizen, constantly adjusting, will continually to improve their business. The bottom line on anything export is competitive advantage. What is the advantage? The question that you have to be able to answer, and you will hear me say this dozens of times in the coming weeks and in the past and every time, is why in the world would somebody buy that product? If I'm a buyer in Dubai for dried fruit, I can buy from anywhere in the world. I have product being offered to me from Thailand, from the Philippines, from Cambodia, from Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, the United States, everywhere. So why would I buy from one origin over the other? And that's called your competitive advantage or comparative advantage. And as a consultant, your job is to help the companies identify what their competitive advantages are. Sometimes it's seasonality, sometimes it's packaging, sometimes it's labor. So it's all the factors of production: land, labor, and capital. So your job as a consultant is to help them identify what that competitive advantage is, and then to know the trade opportunities and how to research them. And we will talk at length about different tools for research. And when I first got in the export business back in the 1980s, the internet did not exist. So to discover a market, I had to go to the market. Now today, sitting here in Seattle with the internet, I can tell you what's being sold in every major market of the world or every market in the world. I can look at what's in the stores. I can look at consumer trends. So we will talk about some of those tools. We can't talk about them all because there are way too many to cover in any single course. But there's the more you explore, the more you understand that's what's out there. So one of the first things as a consultant that we have to look at is, can the business sustain and support international trade, to support the growth of business? The export will put additional requirements on capital, on labor, on raw materials. And I've had situations where we help a company develop their export business, but then they fail, not because of the export plan being wrong or not being accurate, but the fact that they cannot meet the demand, or their priorities are for their domestic market and they cannot get product to go for the export. So one of the challenges is, yes, we can help you build your export business, but can you support it? So this is a list of the really what I just talked about, the business. What business am I in? Help the company define what business they're in. There are businesses that are in the business of packaging, and I mean packaging, processing fruit. There are growers, and there are branding companies that market a brand of product, and they don't always complement each other, but they can, and they don't always compete, but they can. So understanding the business, the product, is there demand for my product? We see this a lot where we go into a country and everybody's trying, USAID and other agencies are trying to help them increase their production of a product, only to find out that the product has no demand, or that it's the wrong variety, the wrong species, or the wrong seasonality. So, a lot of times, the best product for export is a product that they're not currently producing. We did this down in Peru, where 25 years ago, Peru did not produce any asparagus. There was no domestic demand for asparagus. There was no production. It wasn't a traditional product. And a group of us, including some good friends of mine, were able to look at the agricultural capabilities and say, wow, Peru's a great position to produce asparagus. It was a startup operation in planting asparagus, getting people to know how to produce it. And last year, Peru exported about $360 million worth of asparagus, a product that was not a traditional crop for them to produce. Now they're doing the same thing on blueberries. 20 years ago, I went to Peru and said, wow, you guys should produce blueberries. And people laughed at me. Now I don't know what the number is, but there's millions and millions of dollars of blueberries being shipped from Peru. So they weren't in the blueberry business, they were in the agricultural production business. And consultants like myself went down and said, based on what you have, based on your resources, here's what you should be producing. So we knew what the competitive advantages were. In Peru, for example, we knew that it was, they had cheap land and cheap labor and good water. What you need to look at is, what are the competitive advantage in Turkmenistan? My initial impression is that one of the competitive advantages is the cheap cost of energy. And that makes products like greenhouse tomatoes attractive, because you're competing with countries where the cost of land and labor and energy are very high. The why in the world would anybody produce or purchase my product? You have to teach your exporters the answer to that question before they meet with the buyers. So when the buyer is saying, what's special about your product, they need to be able to answer that question. And then, what resources do you have to support the sales? So as a business consultant, you need to understand the business. You need to understand, look beyond the obvious, understand the markets, and make sure that the business skills are in place to achieve the objectives. If you're looking strictly at exports, you got to be careful, because they may not have the internal resources to support your export business. So it's not just a matter of, let's look at and build an export plan. We also have to understand the business. We have to understand their principles. We have to understand why they're doing what they're doing. So to do this, you really start at a 30,000 foot level and drill down. So you're drilling down to get to the final details. When the business manager, he's looking at things from ground level, and this is a literal expression. He's looking at it from ground level. He can't see what's beyond what he's got from the day. And in the course of the day, he's got all kinds of emails and problems and production problems, logistic problems to address. He a lot of times doesn't have the vision or the time to look beyond what's right in front of him. So your job, again, as a consultant, is to look from the 30,000 foot level, as if you're in an airplane flying by. What is it that you see? And you start at 30,000 feet and then you drill down. You drill down to the finite details of the business, but you need to understand the atmosphere that they're working in, the environment, and you need to understand what the business objectives are, what the owner's objectives are. A lot of times we've built businesses that don't make sense from an economic standpoint, but from the owner's standpoint and from their long-term objectives, they do. So you need to understand what their objectives are, because they are your client. We teach people, particularly in food, to find a niche. It's terrible to try and sell something that everybody else is selling. In fact, and we'll talk about this a little bit in pricing when we get to that session, but if your neighbor is planting wheat, it's time to plant barley, because if everybody's planting wheat, the price of barley is going to go up. So that's one way to change your product from being the same as everybody else sells. The other is to produce a different product. And here we have pictures of industrial production. And a lot of times companies don't look at selling ingredients, but from a country like Turkmenistan, selling ingredients into Europe or into the Middle East is a good, viable opportunity. You need to look at, do you see the square watermelons there? That's a huge opportunity that takes people to have an advantage on labor. It's a product that's sold into Japan and at a very high price. So a good watermelon will sell for $100 a piece or more. In Japan, labor costs are very high, land is very high. So can you competitively produce a square watermelon? It's different. It's not what traditionally is done. So there's the ingredient market. There's a specialty niche market, which is smaller volumes but larger profit margins, because it's consumers are not looking to buy something strictly on price. They're looking to buy it based on its quality or its special characteristics. Retail and food service. Everybody wants to have their product on the retail grocery store shelf. It's a lot easier to introduce a product to the international market, to the food service industry, to get it to the restaurants, the hotels, the prisons, the schools, because they don't care what the brand is. They care about the quality of the product. So they're going to care about the quality and the price. Where at retail, the brand image can drive the quality and the price down. Whether you're doing processed or fresh, we talk a lot of companies that are doing, for example, a fresh onion. We talk to them and say, there's opportunity in the global market for a frozen, sliced, and sauteed onion. You add value in your country, and we're talking about this in Egypt, for example, where the labor rates are very low. If Egypt can produce a sauteed frozen onion and sell it to restaurants and hotels in Europe or in Dubai, they're producing a value-added product, taking advantage of their competitive strengths, and selling a product that is no longer a commodity. So those are things as the consultant you need to look at is really, they're not in the business of producing watermelon, they're producing and growing melons. So are they growing the right variety? Is it what sells in Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan and Tajikistan isn't what sells in Europe and the United States? This is a video that I'd like to play for you. So it's a fun one.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
So that's an interesting video because, and the first time I watched it, I watched the team in white and I came up with 13 passes and I thought, hey, this is great. But then only then did I realize that there the walking bear was there. And that's kind of a parable for our businesses. As the business owner and business manager, we're watching the team in white and we're going to miss the dancing bear. And your job as consultants is to help them see the dancing bear, to see what they're not looking for. So you want to understand, again, just to reiterate, you want to understand the business competitive and comparative advantages. What is it? Why would the person buy the product? And advantages of being international in their sales. Before you look at the customers and at the international markets, you must understand the entire business before you tell them how to improve it. And again, it's we've done it a lot of times. We're trying to find customers and we're out knocking on doors only to find that the entrepreneurship and the leadership and the skills of charm dance and other skills are not there. The organization isn't capable of doing the exports. This happened to us on a product that we took from Central Asia to Japan, showed it to 7-Eleven Japan, which had 37,000 stores. They were very interested in the product, but the supplier wasn't able to supply it because they didn't have HACCP, or the HACCP that they had wasn't appropriate. So we did the export work, but we weren't able to conclude the sales until all these other things took place first. So tools to assess the business, skills needed and opportunities. You need to consider all of these: risk, appropriate quality, networking advantages and markets. And charm dance, we talk about appropriate quality because the quality that you think is best doesn't mean that somebody else does. We did wine out of Georgia, and the country of Georgia was very proud of their wine. They sold it throughout the Soviet Union. And they felt that their wine was the finest in the world. But you give their wine to Europeans or Americans, and they didn't like it because it was too sweet. The names they could not pronounce because they were in Russian. So they had to adjust what they produced to fit the market. So it was good quality. It fit the market that they were selling to, but if they were going to expand, they had to look at another market. The key here too is execution. None of these skills, none of the things we talked about in charm dance, and none of the things we're going to talk about here are any good unless you act upon them. And you as a consultant, your job is to help the companies act upon those. So when we do an assessment of a business and we do assessment of market opportunities, in the perfect world, we utilize three individual aspects. The first is an initial survey to develop a benchmark. And we'll talk about that here in a moment. The next one is a physical review. We like to go through the plant and look at the equipment, look at the technology, look what they're currently producing. And really, and it's not me doing that in most cases, it's a food process engineer, because they understand what the equipment can do and really get an idea of what the capabilities are. Because again, the best moving export product may not be the product that they're currently producing, but their equipment is able to produce. So we do a physical review next. In the times of COVID, we're doing those virtually. We've got food process engineers that do them via Zoom and Teams, and even just a cell phone, doing WhatsApp, walking through the plant. And then we interview the leadership team. We combine the reviews and answer the question and ask questions based on what we've seen in the initial survey and the physical review. One of the tools that we use for this is called Forms. It's a Microsoft Office 365 service. It is a survey template, basically. And you can come on here. You see on the left here is all the different Microsoft Office 365 programs. And then it's got the forms. And under forms, we're able to develop a survey, a questionnaire. You can see here we've done, a number of these to get different responses. That puts the responses into an Excel format, et cetera, that we can review. I've got a quick video here that will cover some of that. Inside of Microsoft Forms, you can build a number of forms. Forms are like surveys that allow the recipient to fill in questionnaires. You can see here that 2020 has a number of forms that we've developed, each with its own images and backgrounds and questions. I'm going to click on this one as an example. This is a form we developed to solicit information from food manufacturers in Lebanon. You can see here we have a number of questions, and you can add questions very easily by just hitting here, add questions. One thing to be sure of is to click long so that a question like this that has a company name and they may go on is there. You also need to make that it's required so that they can't skip a question that you need an answer for. You'll also find that at times you can do yes or no, you can do multiple choice. You see here we did multiple choice. So it allows you quite flexibility. It allows the customer to take the survey by accessing it via the internet. You can preview it here. You can change the themes, which is how we change this background. To see the responses, in this case, we've got 20 responses, average time to complete it. It's 43 minutes. A lot of that is time where people sign on and then they go about doing something else. When you're working on a form, it'll tell you how long it should take a person to work through it. This summary page here tells you what keywords are coming up. It tells you how the answers are coming on, tells you the titles of the people filling them. So it takes the answers, kind of compiles them into a single thing. You can also export it to an Excel, or you can review the results. We can come in here and view individual company results. And you can see here, this company took 29 minutes. This one took 20. And you scroll through here, you can also print it, or you can delete it. But it's a great tool for soliciting information, particularly when you have a group of people. This can also work for consumers, anything where you want to do a survey. We recommend working with forms. It's available through the Microsoft 365 platform, and free after that. So it's a great tool. Excuse me, I'm going to move my chats over here so I can see them. All right. All right, so the forms, like I say, it's Microsoft Office 365. I think we paid $5 a month per person. That gives us our own email address as well. It's definitely worth the efforts and time for it. So again, we need to understand what business they're in, understand the opportunities. It may not be what they produce, but it's what they can produce. That's why doing the assessments and walking through the factory. We've had several times where our food process engineers walk through a factory, see a piece of equipment that's not currently being utilized, and we realize that it can be utilized for various things. So we will recommend that they use it to produce a new product, or we may find that they need a new piece of equipment that we can help them source and supply. So as a consultant, your job doesn't begin with the export. It begins with making sure they're producing the right product for export. The key is to produce what you can sell, not sell what you produce. And that's an important concept. It's a very fine line in terms of verbiage, but too many companies, again, they're producing the wrong size or the wrong specifications or the wrong variety. And as the consultant and doing the market research, your job is to try and find what it is that the market's buying. I've personally sold millions of dollars of product that I don't like, that I will not consume myself, but I'm not selling it to myself, I'm selling it to my customers. So that's the same thing we found with the Georgian winemakers, is they thought their wine was perfect, and to them it was. But if they're going to sell it, they have to appeal to the customer, not to themselves. All right. So this is a great picture because we see here 3 different kinds of melons. The one on the bottom, or in the middle, being held by the gentleman, is came actually from Central Asia. I don't remember which country it came from, but this was in Spain. It was really there as a novelty. The consumers in Spain are not going to buy that for their family, because that would, they have small apartments. They have to, a lot of times they don't have a car, so they're walking back to their apartment. They're not going to carry that. A restaurant might be able to use it, but as far as the consumers, it's a limited product. It's a novelty, and obviously, it hit the market, but it's not going to be a quick mover. The one up in the right-hand corner in my hand is a personal size watermelon that's sold here in the United States. Costco and other retailers will sell that product, and the housewife and the consumer will take it home, put it in the refrigerator, pull it out, and eat it. It also does not have seeds. The US and Europe do not like seeds in their watermelon as a rule. So if we try to sell a watermelon produced that has seeds in it, we're not meeting the consumer demands. So one of the things as a consultant, we're trying to do the research, and I can look at it and say, okay, they're selling watermelons, and the statistics, the numbers will show us that they're selling watermelons, but it won't tell us the size. It won't tell us the variety. And that means that we have to take time and go to the retail outlets, which we can do online, and we'll talk about that, and figure out exactly what it is they're selling. This is oops, go back here. It's another form that we have that we talked about it briefly earlier. It's on the IDU&I website to download, and it gives us the basic information on the company. It allows it to puts it into a format. If you don't have a form and go in freehand and go in free flow, you're not going to get all the information you need. So taking the time to develop a form. And the other thing is, once you develop the form, you can use that form over and over again with multiple clients. Now, this was done on paper. You could do the same thing inside of Microsoft Forms. So it's got some real versatility, but you need to start. And like I say, the template or the PDF is online. You can take a look at it and figure out what we're asking, but that doesn't mean necessarily that they're appropriate for you to ask. Now, when you're reviewing the business, we talked before about SWOT analysis. We'll talk about it briefly again, but you need to review raw materials, production, shipping, accounting, sales, and the owner's objectives. And we'll talk here about why these all matter. Raw materials matter because they may be limited. We've had sales teams that go, oh, we can sell 30,000 units. Well, production says you're only going to get 5. So you need to balance those. And talking to production as the consultant, production may say, yeah, we can only get 5 of that, but we can get 25 of this other one. Can they substitute? Is there demand for it? Maybe we need to change the varieties again for export. So you need to determine, is the variety a fit? It may or may not fit international demand. What one country consumes doesn't mean the other country is going to consume it. And I'm going to mention it now. We, for example, in the state of Washington, we're one of the biggest apple producers and shippers and exporters in the world. And we never in our grocery stores have big apples. Our apples are a smaller size because the big apples are going to China and Taiwan and Hong Kong because they want a big apple because they give the apple as a gift. Now, if anybody in my family ever gave me an apple as a gift, I'd really scratch my head and wonder why. But in their culture, giving a big red apple is a blessing for them. So that's something they do. Now, it works out well because the US consumer doesn't like a big apple. So we send the big apples to Taiwan, and we keep the smaller apples here in the United States. So that fits well. Now, the problem would arise if we both like the same quality and the same size, the same variety. Then the exporter has to figure out, do they sell in the export market or the domestic markets? And we'll talk about that shortly. When you're doing the consulting work, you need to determine, do they have sufficient quantity for export? Do they have sufficient quality? Doesn't matter if they have lots of quantity, if the quality is not good enough, the quality doesn't match. And the timing. Now in crops and agriculture, we have to depend upon the timing of the crop. And if your cherries, for example, come in a week before the cherries out of Chile or the United States are harvested, then you have an opportunity. This year, we supported the movement of cherries from Uzbekistan to Dubai because the window of opportunity on those fresh cherries was good. The opportunity to sell into the market was there. It expired very quickly because cherries from other markets came in at lower prices, but for that brief period of time, they were the only cherries available on the market. So as a consultant working with agricultural products, you'll want to take a look at the timing of the crop, determine if there is a fit, if there is a window. And one thing that's interesting in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, for the North, product starts in the south end of the North and moves upwards. In the South, it starts at the North end and moves southwards. And you have to figure out where you fit on that spectrum. You may be able to supply product to Ukraine, who's in the North, but not to Italy, who's in the South, because Italy's producing sooner. But later in the season, when Italy's not producing anymore, if you're still able to produce, you can sell down there. So understanding the seasonality of the crops will help the business determine what they should be producing and exporting. And price, is the price too high? Sometimes domestic demand exceeds international demand. We see that in palm oil in Sierra Leone, where the domestic demand for palm oil has the price higher than what the exporter could get exporting the product. So even though a lot of development agencies want to increase the exports, they can't because the domestic demand is too high and too strong. So exports sound great, but if the domestic demand exceeds that, then they can't compete on the international market. So the other question is, if you increase the demand for export, what is that going to do with the raw materials available for the domestic market? Can your purchasing department handle the additional workload? Can they handle the additional flow of product coming in? And do you have the logistics capacity? It doesn't matter if you plan on exporting a lot of product, but you only have one dock to load the container out of, or you cannot get trucks to ship the product. So you also have to assess the personnel of the company. And companies like to think their people can do everything, but the reality is there are times when there are hesitations or limits. One of the things I want to point out here on the personnel is speaking of English and writing English. English is still the world's business language. There are more Chinese that speak English than there are Americans. So having the ability in your office to speak English is critical, to read English is critical. Now you can count on Google Translate and other services to help, but you can't count on them to build your brochures in the proper dialect of the country. English is interesting because we have British English, American English, Indian English, Hong Kong English, Singapore English, Australian English, multiple English versions that are all different. And you can't necessarily take one document from one country and try and make it work for another. I had a big argument with the French Railroad when we were working with them on some products coming to the United States, and we were arguing over an English term that no American had ever heard. So you need to make sure that somebody speaks English, and when you develop company brochures and materials, that a native speaker from the country that you're working with understands and helps out. You need to make sure that the export manager understands the value of the business, the values of the business, so that they understand what the objectives are from the owner's standpoint. The export manager needs to be aware of the competition. That's how they identify the competitive and comparative advantage. if I know my product's good, I have to know why somebody else's isn't, or why somebody else is better. So the export manager has to spend time to understand the market. Corporate management has to understand what you're doing and has to be kept in the loop. My first export sale, which was for a cooperative, the executive vice president of finance contacted me and asked me why we sold to somebody without credit. We had a letter of credit, but he didn't understand that. He didn't understand what a letter of credit did for him. So, my job was to educate the management as to what their risks were and what their opportunities were. So as a consultant, you need to talk to the management and find out what their objectives are. Sometimes a management will have an objective to sell to the US market, for example. There may be alternative motives for them doing that. Maybe they want to sell to the US because they want to come to the US. Maybe they want to sell to Italy because they've always wanted to go to Italy. Understanding that will help them accomplish their goals. And their goals may not be numbers. It may not be just bottom line. There are other things that the management may have as an objective. So in analyzing the business, you've got basically 4 factors: land, labor, and capital. And capital, I've changed to resources because those resources are also equipment. It's not just cash in the bank, but it's what equipment do they have. And the equipment doesn't have to be new. You notice up there on the right is an old cotton machine. It's old doesn't mean it's not the best machine that's available out there to do it. And the cost of that machine is still very low because it's already been paid for. So understanding the resources, understanding the land, what can the land produce, and understanding the labor. It's funny, we have some countries that we work with where labor rates are extremely low. Tunisia, for example, 30% of the population is unemployed, but we can't get them to work in a crab factory because they don't want to pull the meat off of the crab. So companies are taking the crab and shipping it to Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, where they will work to pull the meat off the crab. So even though we look at it from a statistical standpoint and say, wow, their labor rates are low, they've got lots of unemployed, this should be a great opportunity. There are other factors that enter into that. The willingness of the people to work, how much money they have coming in from diaspora, what their family situation is, and understanding the culture relating to the labor issues is important. Capital is more than just the dollars and cents or yen or renminbi or euros. It's all of the other assets of the business. And entering the export business is going to put a drain on capital. It's different flow of getting paid for product than there is for domestic sales. So we'll talk about this a little bit more when we're talking about payment. But from a consultant analyzing the business, you have to figure out, can the business afford to sell product internationally? Somebody have something to say? Okay. And I'm just going to keep going through. If somebody does have something to say, just turn your mic on and I can answer a question or change a scope or whatever. But as a consultant, you want to make sure that the business has the capital, has the money to finance the export business. Labor and staff, is the plant running efficiently? Doesn't do any good to try and find export business if the plant's already running at 100% capacity. You're not going to be able to do anything. What is the capacity of the plant? What are the fixed costs of materials? The fixed cost of the equipment. The equipment is there whether it's running at 10% capacity or 100% capacity. So what are the marginal costs? Now, we don't talk about getting into analyzing the business from a financial standpoint. That's a totally different class and totally different perspective. So you're not going to figure out what the cost of production is. But as a consultant, you will be able to look at the equipment and realize if it's running at 30% capacity, for example, the marginal cost, the added cost to put more product through there is very small versus somebody that needs to go out and purchase new equipment. Can the labor force work? And we see that again, like in Tunisia, where they aren't willing to work to separate the meat from the crab. It doesn't matter if we have a great business plan if the labor force isn't there. We see in Egypt, for example, where the women work for a couple of years until they get married and then they leave the workforce. That's very different from what we see in Tajikistan, where the women, or the US or several other markets where the women make a career out of their jobs. So it's a different workforce that we have to understand. How does that relate to the product? How does it relate to the quality of the product? We had a situation in in Mexico, where we're working with asparagus. And there was one factory that was doing an excellent job of sorting the asparagus. All the asparagus going into a package was the same size, the same quality, the same maturity. We go down the road 5 miles to another factory, and the quality was terrible. The people were just throwing the product into a box. We said, well, why don't you teach them, tell them to do it right? He says, well, if I correct them, they'll quit and go work for the people down the road. And the people down the road were selling their product for $2 more a case or a flat than he was, because they were able to sell it at a premium. So understanding how the labor force works is important, and understanding how you can use that to your advantage and what disadvantages are there that you need to overcome. Assessing the product, and we will do more of this throughout the course. It's not something we're going to do all today or all in a single session, because it is intertwined and interlaced with everything that we talk about. But assessing the product, start with a review of the equipment. And that's why I say we do the walkthrough assessment, the actual, let's go take a look at the factory. Again, we don't focus on what they're producing, but what they can produce. We understand the resources. So make sure that you understand the capabilities. What is the put through? How much product can it produce in an hour? I've had factories where our food process engineers go through and say, wow, this machine can do a ton an hour. And this machine, which is the next machine in the process, can only do a quarter of a ton. You need 4 of those for every one of those to work. So you need to understand that. You don't need to be a food process engineer, but you need to have resources available to get to that level. You need to understand how to modify and what capabilities to modify the product for the market. For example, if it's a different variety, that's a relatively easy change on a crop like watermelon, which is a seasonal crop. It's not so easy on a crop like apricots, where you got to plant the tree and wait for the tree to mature. So you need to understand how easy is it to change the varieties for the market. If it's just a function of changing the size, for example, on our apples here in Washington, there are producers that produce large apples. They don't harvest them when they're small. They have varieties that grow larger, and they're producing those for a specific market. Now they're taking a risk, because if that market has a failure or if there's an issue, they have no place else they can sell that product. But in most cases, they've understood their risk. The R in charm dance, they've assessed their, what the exposure they have, and they can determine, do I want to have all large apples? Now, the bigger packers will have some hectares of large and some hectares of small and some hectares of medium, some hectares of red apples and some of yellow. So they diversify and spread their risk between different crops and different markets. And again, the owner of that orchard may not like, golden delicious apples, but he grows them because he can sell them. And you need to understand the product, the packaging. What are the capabilities? We'll talk more about packaging later, but the size of a product that sells in the United States is totally different than the size of a product that sells in Japan or Europe or Africa. So understanding what capabilities are. And one of the most important things from export standpoint, and this is the biggest thing that can stop all the good work we do, is if the company doesn't have the appropriate international certificates, primarily sanitation certificates, starting with HACCP and Global GAP, going from there on to BRC and ISO 22000. These are all standards that if the exporter does not have, it really limits their capabilities to export. There are some markets where product can go without those certificates. but it's becoming fewer and fewer all the time. Even the Russian market now is requiring more and more of the international standard certificates. There are still markets within markets that allow for a product to come in without those certificates. In Middle East, in the Dubai and United Arab Emirates, there is product that meets the standards, and there is a market for product that doesn't. So that is an opportunity for companies that don't have those standards to knock on the door and get things started. But those standards are, I get up on the soapbox and yell to the world that if you don't have those standards, it's kind of a waste of our time to try and help you develop the export business. So, understanding the products, and the HACCP certificate is for a product, not for a factory. Now there can be multiple products on the certificate, but if I'm producing HACCP or dried apricots and apricot jam, that's two totally different processes, and I need two totally different HACCP programs in place. So one of the problems that we run into in agriculture is we can't control supply. We can boost it, we can support it, but we can't control it. We can't control the quality from one year to the next or one day to the next. And that's why markets change. And that's why it's important for your exporters to constantly monitor the markets. What happens if there's a crop shortage? If in this case, the product is split and the quality is not there, what do they do? If you've been selling to Carrefour, for example, in Dubai or in France, they expect to get the product. And if you have a crop failure, if you cut them out this year, they're not going to buy from you next year. They need somebody that's reliable. But if you don't have the quality to sell them, you've got to tell them. And that goes back to the H in charm, dance, and honesty. You've got to tell them, here's what we have available. What the best exporters do is they will take their crop and figure out that if their exports are 20% of their business, if the crop goes down, they'll still export 20% of their business. So their customers get something. And you can sit down and explain to your customer. That's why, again, communication, the C in charm dance, you need to constantly communicate with your buyers as to what the crop situations are. What are the yields? What are the harvest? What is the season? Is it going to be early? Is it going to be late? Or is there a chance for infestation? So keeping them informed helps them make a decision. You make a commitment to export, you're harvesting and producing product for export. You need to support that. You don't produce product for the domestic market, and then when you have a surplus, try and sell it export. That inconsistency doesn't bring you buyers. That's called spot trading, and few reliable buyers constantly buy on spot. They'll buy on spot to meet their needs. If they need 10 containers in a week and they only get 9, they'll buy a spot container. If they buy 10 and they get 10, but their demand is for 11, they'll buy a spot container. But that's not consistent business for an exporter. You can export spot without certificates as long as your buyer knows, and they're taking the risk. So what are the limits in production? Again, capacity of sorting, capacity of labor, the standards of traceability. Most buyers globally now will not purchase product where there's not traceability. Again, spot buyers and hawkers on the streets of Singapore can consider product that's not certified and traceable, but they're paying a lower price for it than a retailer like Carrefour or Metro or Costco or Whole Foods or Trader Joe's, because they're taking a risk. The ones that don't take a risk need to know the standards and need to know that your product is traceable. In non-COVID times, buyers will do a plant inspection. We had in 2020, we were in Dubai with the CTJ program project for USAID, and there were several exporters from Turkmenistan there. One of the buyers from Del Monte, large global brand, $1 billion+ in sales, said they were interested in a container a week of tomatoes for the Dubai market, but they had to do a plant inspection. That was February of 2020, and COVID has locked things down. And as far as I know, that business never came to fruition, though the buyer was ready, but they needed to do the plant visit. They can't just rely upon the exporter saying, oh yeah, we do great quality control, or HACCP certificate or a global gap certificate. They will want to go and inspect the plant. I've been into hundreds of plants around the world, and I've been into probably 15 to 20% of those have HACCP certificates that would not stand up to an inspection. I've been into factories that have HACCP, and you go in the front door and there's no soap. People can't wash their hands. That's the first thing you got to do before you get to the plant. So the buyers, good, reliable buyers, are willing to pay a good price for it, and their money is good and the risk is low, will require a plant inspection. And some of them are still doing it. Buyers right now are struggling globally. The freight rates are 10 times what they were 6 months ago. Here in the US, we have 80, 90 ships sitting outside the ports waiting to get in. I had product that arrived in Houston in August, and it still has not arrived in California 2 months, almost 3 months later. So buyers are struggling to meet their current demand and not looking at trying to find new sources. Makes it difficult, but it is a good time to try and open some of those doors. Logistics, I mentioned that, the slowdown in logistics, the problems associated with trucking and getting product out. Now, one of the things that we've learned is that there are opportunities for trucks to go from Central Asia to a number of to Turkey or the Middle East, because a lot of trucks are coming in with consumer goods and can go back out with food products. So there are some opportunities to fill those trucks back up. Accounting, and this is a screenshot of a QuickBooks program, which is an accounting program. Tracking international shipments is not the same as tracking domestic sales. Your process of documentation and your payment process are completely different. Back in the 1990s, I wrote a program for tracking export sales, tracking quotes, tracking bills of lading, pro forma invoices. A program like QuickBooks, which is pictured here and available, probably even available in Russian. If not, I'm sure there are versions of similar programs that are, that will allow you to adapt them to fit your international trade. It's important that, the D in detail and dance is for details. It's important that the details of the pro forma invoice, the packing list, the commercial invoice, all those things are accurate. And if you're doing them by hand, your accuracy level goes down. So having a computer program like QuickBooks makes your life easier and less risk for error and things more efficient. You can also track inventory and raw materials, the manufacturing process, MRP and ERP, enterprise resource planning, and manufacturing resource planning programs are out there. You have to be big to be able to afford and implement those. A program like QuickBooks, you can be a one-man operation and still find the benefit of it. It's much easier than trying to do things manually or on spreadsheets. Sales are limited, and as a consultant, you want to find out what's going to limit the sales: lack of English capabilities. If people don't speak English, no matter what country I go to, English is spoken. So lack of knowledge of the business. Your salespeople, the people approaching the customers, need to understand the business, what its objectives are. And again, that's what your job as a consultant at the 30,000 foot level on down to the ground level is, to identify, quantify, and document what those objectives are. We have a saying that says, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So as a consultant, your job is to pave the road, to show them here's where you're going. Now, as a business, you often find that you get to a point in the road, you need to make a decision and shift and change. And when you make that shift and change, you need to be able to understand what the risks associated with it and what the options are. If your business has been reviewed at all levels, then you'll be able to make those changes appropriately. Lack of support from management. Again, management needs to understand what you're trying to accomplish. A lot of times export managers are hired because it's sexy for people to say they're doing export. But then when there's a struggle on materials and there's a challenge between the domestic and the international market, the domestic market wins out. You need to understand, and the management needs to understand the long-term aspects of developing international trade. Getting into a country like Japan with a product, or even Dubai with a product like the fresh cherries that we did, it's a long-term perspective. It's not a one-off, it's not spot trade, it's building relationships. Again, back to C, communications and charm dance, building those relationships. And that means you have to have management support to understand the long-term process of international trade. So again, we have to assess the management's objectives. What are they trying to accomplish? What are their goals and what are their expectations? When do they expect international sales to occur? And your job as a consultant is to enlighten them, is to help inform them that those objectives may or may not be realistic. If they're not realistic, then you need to help them see and understand why. And that's where your research, which is the next session that we talk about, your research will help document. So it's not just your opinion, but it's here's why, here's what makes sense. We recently did a report where we provided lots of documents to our client, but the client didn't want to hear what we had to say. We basically said, for this particular product from this country, there is no market. They didn't want to hear that. And we as a consultants refused to change our reports just to meet the expectations of what they preconceived would happen. So you have to understand going into it, if your owners are not open to listening to the facts, then you're going to have a problem. So you need to be able to have the facts, say, here's what we've done. So we'll talk about that, how to get those facts in the next session. Getting management to open up. A lot of times management does not like to open up and explain what their business is. They feel it's confidential. They don't want to share. That's fine, but they also have to understand that it limits what you can do. One of the things we like to do with management is get them away from the office. Have a retreat, go to a restaurant, go to a park, go to whatever, and sit down with them and go over the SWOT analysis and go over the T charts and go over their products, their objectives. And to do that with not just the owner of the business, but we've talked about production and logistics and accounting, talk about all those, because they all need to coordinate. Again, you can't tell an export salesperson that he can't sell the product because you don't have enough production. He needs to understand that before he offers the product out. So leaving the facilities, leaving the office, puts everybody on a common ground, but it also gets the manager away from his everyday troubles. It gets him in a situation where he's able to focus on the long term. After we do the review, what do we do with the findings? So we reviewed the product, the assets, the business, the objectives, the supply. What do we do now? And again, we talked about this the other day. We do a SWOT analysis, a T chart. We do the OODA loop, which we'll talk about here shortly. And there's the PEST, which we talked about last time, and we'll touch about again briefly. So T chart, and I call this a modified T chart because it's actually got another aspect to it, and that's over here in the plan section. T chart is simple. Strengths and weaknesses. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? And how do they fit? And we do that for products. We do that for people. We do that for markets. We also find that sometimes a strength and a weakness can be the same characteristic. We just need to ramp it up or play it down. Now, the one thing that's different about this T chart from what most consultants teach is I have the third part, which is called the plan. It doesn't do you any good if you identify the strengths and weaknesses and you don't execute. Going back to charm dance, it's the E in dance is execution. So you have to have a plan. So we've put this together. This is something that can be done informally, but it's something that should be done on, again, products, markets, management, operations, etc. SWOT analysis, I won't cover that in detail here. We're probably all familiar with it at some point in time, but it's critical. And it's not just a SWOT analysis of the business. You do SWOT analysis on down to the product level. What is the opportunities, strengths, weaknesses, and threats of an individual product? And it is a constant cycle. One thing about SWOT analysis, it's a snapshot, but to make it effective and to execute properly, those activities change all the time, particularly in agriculture. Opportunities can change. 2 years ago, Europe, it would have been 2019, Europe had a shortage of onions. That was an opportunity. If I was just focused on my daily business, I wouldn't have even known that Europe had a shortage. But because I'm a student of the market, which is M in charm dance, student of the market, I understand and I'm paying attention to what's going on with the market in Europe. I think it would have been 2018 or 2017, Europe had a shortage of eggplant or aubergine. They typically do not buy that product, but that year they did because they had a crop failure. So as a student of the market, I'm watching that, and that opportunity is constantly changing. Australia, for example, produces a lot of chickpeas. If I'm a chickpea producer in Turkmenistan or in Russia or any chickpea trader, and I notice that there's a weather problem in Australia, my opportunities all of a sudden have changed. The Australian crop is going to impact the opportunities for my crop. So I need to keep an eye on that. So the opportunities, the threats are, it's very similar, and the threat is that they have a great crop. So you constantly modify and you constantly review that aspect. I'm going to skip this video for today. It is online. You can go watch it. It's I think about a 10-minute video by Sean. Sean is a successful U.S. businessman. He's run a manufacturer, and it's interesting. A good story on that is when he started working for the manufacturer, they produced a commercial absorbent that was used to absorb oil spills and chemical spills. And 99% of their business was in the commercial absorbent business. He went in and did a SWOT analysis and realized and reviewed the product and realized that the product also made a great kitty litter, an absorbent for cats to use as a bathroom. And by the time he sold the company, or they sold the company, they had flipped it. They were 99% cat litter and 10% commercial absorbent. Again, they went in and looked not what the company was doing, but what the company could do, what the product could do. So this SWOT analysis here by Sean, it is a good example of the importance of SWOT. We have it online, both as a YouTube and as linked back to our site as well. So here's an example of a SWOT analysis. And you can take a look at that online and see how those factors fit into yours. The factors will differ from business to business, and they'll differ from time to time. So as homework, and we'll put this onto the assignment and to the course materials, is to do a SWOT analysis. Now you can do it for your product or your company, but to do a SWOT analysis. If we were in person doing this at the next session, I would have people talk to us about what their SWOT analysis found. And sometimes people don't like to talk about their own business. So if, in that case, we would have them talk about water, selling water. What is the strength and weaknesses of the water that they're selling? But going through the process is critical. So if you can, we'll put an assignment on the course to have you complete it. And I'll take a look at them and provide some feedback. So SWOT analysis, listen and watch for trends. Again, it doesn't stop the day you're done with the analysis. You're looking at trends, you're looking at the economy, you're looking at consumer choices. Consumer preferences change. It's interesting today, Amazon announced, during COVID, their stock flew crazy because all Americans could get all the things they needed from Amazon. And their year-over-year profits were down 50% this year over last. That was just announced today after the stock market closed. And that's because the trends changed, the consumer needs changed, the COVID changed. So, there are factors that enter in outside of your business that's a threat, and you need to be able to adjust quickly to that. So one of the things that not all SWOT analysis do is the 5-year plan. Where are you going to be 5 years from now? Again, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So the objective is to have a path, to know where you're going. Mitsubishi, the big Japanese trading company and manufacturer, they manufacture everything from cars to food, has a 300-year business plan. Now, none of us know where we're going to be 300 years from now. We all pray that we'll still be here, inshallah. But they have a plan. So all the things in certain departments are looking at where are we going to be 5, 10, 15, 20, and 30 years, and in their case, 300 years from now. A good friend of mine from Singapore entered the US market back in the early 2000s, bought a big company here. And he sold it a couple of years later because he said the American businesses were looking short term. They're looking at the next stock report, the next board meeting. Him being Chinese and a family-owned business, he's looking at the next generation. So having that long-term perspective is important, and taking your SWOT analysis and applying that to a 5-year plan. Most businesses here in the States don't have 5-year plans. Small businesses are, particularly in times of COVID, they're doing what they need to survive. But the companies that do have 5-year plans are moving their businesses that way. So taking these and as a consultant, particularly from the export side, is where do you want to be in a market 5 years from now? And it may take you 3 years to get your first shipment into the market. The management has to be patient to put up with that and wait for that as you develop it. You need to do the right things to get there. But you have the 5-year plan. Which markets do you want to have? Which ones do you want to have market share on? So there's another program that's less popular than SWOT. It's called the OODA Loop. And the OODA Loop was actually developed by US fighter pilots. And the objective is to observe, orient, decide what to do, and act. And then you observe again. And then you orient, and then you decide what to do and react. And it's a constantly changing system. In this case, it was how to do fights in the sky and how to adjust. And so you observe what's happening, then you determine which direction you're going to go. And so from a business standpoint, the concept is I look at what's going on out there, I figure out which direction I want to go, and I go. And then I look again, and then I decide what to do, and then I go. So as a consultant, again, you're teaching the companies a process that they can use when you're gone. It's not something that we want to teach and then walk away and they never use again. The OODA Loop, which also ties in with Kaizen, Keizen, which is a Japanese word for constantly improving. And the Japanese manufacturer and almost every company in Japan has a system for constantly reviewing their system. Even though their system may be great today, tomorrow there's going to be improvements and changes that need to be made. So how do they change it? How do they improve it at all times? So that's similar to the OODA Loop in that they're constantly looking at the business. You want to give a tool to the business so that when you leave, they're adjusting their business accordingly. We've talked about this, doing the business on multiple aspects of the business. Don't stop with just the business, but do it on the staff, do it on the products, do it on the resources. Every staff has weaknesses. And I, for example, have a weakness, and one of my weaknesses is D in charm dance, which is details. I'm too busy at the 30,000 foot level on too many things to pay attention to individual details. That's why I hire staff to work with the details, to work with the accounting, to work with the paperwork, to work with formatting a PowerPoint, for example. I can put the PowerPoint together and then I move to the next thing. So when I do a SWOT analysis of myself, one of my weaknesses, or T-chart on myself, my weakness is I don't know and don't have the time to do details, accounting, for example. The plan is to hire somebody to do that. So even though there's a weakness, doesn't mean it's the end of the day or the end of the road. So your analysis should not stop with the business, but it should include the staff, the products, and the resources. This is a simple phrase that, again, tying kind of to the OODA loop. Find the gap. Look for the gap in the market. Where are demands not being taken? Fly to daylight or drive to daylight. How do you get to fill that gap? Constantly, the OODA loop, fly the OODA loop, constantly revise your plans. Fail wisely. And we talked about this in the entrepreneurship section of this effort. Every successful businessman has failed. I can't think of a single one on a global basis or even a regional basis that has constantly been a success. They fail, they make mistakes, but if they fail wisely, and as one of the videos on the university website from Ron Sim, a friend of mine in Singapore who's very wealthy, says, plan to fail. You're going to fail. Take steps, take a risk, understand the risk. You will fail in the process. If you fail wisely, if you send a shipment of a product to a market and it fails because you didn't pack it properly, learn from that mistake. Don't just write it off as a mistake, and if you're communicating with your customer and communicate a solution. On the cherries that we shipped from Uzbekistan to Dubai, the exporter missed the flight out of Uzbekistan. So the product had to sit in the warehouse for 2 days. When the product arrived in Dubai, there was spoilage problems. And the exporter, we say he ghosted, he stopped responding to the importer, didn't address the concerns, disappeared. He'd already been paid for the product, so he walked away. And that's, there's a blog on that on my personal blog about what happened and why. There's a video as well. I think it's on YouTube, but as well on the experience of, they failed, but they didn't change it to a positive. If when they failed, they could have gone back to the customer and said, here's what we did wrong, and here's how we'll correct it, and we are sorry. That customer would have been indebted to them and would have felt comfortable working with them in the future. At this point in time, that particular importer doesn't want to work with the exporter or anybody else in the country, because that is the flavor of the trade that he got, was that the buyer was not valued as a customer. So, the one problem from one exporter impacted all other opportunities going into Uzbekistan for cherries. And it takes some time to correct that. If the exporter had failed wisely, that wouldn't happen. Network minds, no man is an island. Nobody is independent. Everybody depends upon other people and other activities. So listen to your network. And again, that's the end in Charm Dance. Don't focus exclusively on internal issues. PEST, which is to analyze the political, economic, social, and technical factors. Those are constantly changing. So when you're doing those analysis, do a PEST analysis. How does the politics change? In some countries where exports are controlled, things can change overnight. We were working with Uzbekistan, and the president of Uzbekistan declared that all shipments export had to go by rail. That lasted for a while, but all of a sudden the PEST situation, the political and economic factors changed. Companies that were prepared to support that were able to survive, and others that weren't prepared for it had a tough time. So understanding the political factors and how those can change the relationships between countries. Turkey was exporting a lot of product to Russia until they shot down a Russian plane. So politics can change things significantly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is another format for doing a analysis. It's basically ranking characteristics as strongly agree, disagree, neutral, agree, and strongly agree. You then come up with a score. And we can do this for a product. We do this a lot with customers, whether the customer likes the product, the label. So we get a concession on what people like. This is a very similar table. Again, you have numbers. This one actually, instead of going from 1 to 5, will go from -2 to 2. And it basically gives you the same type of number at the end, and you can compare products. So if we're comparing 2 products for export, we do a semantic test or a other ranking test to see how they end up scoring. And we'll see that when we talk about the form for business plan. This is our assessment form. I talked about it briefly, and again, it is on the website. You can download it, change it to meet your requirements, but you need to develop a form. You can see here, one of the main points of this is the standards. What standards do they meet? And then the other, another thing on the far right here is a request for service. What assistance do they need? This is something you can do when you first get the client, is go in and say, well, what is it that you need help with? In this case, assistance product development or product packaging design, securing raw materials. There's a whole group of questions here on what they need assistance on. From that, we can then determine where we want to spend our time and our effort to support them. This is 3 pages here. I think the actual form is 5, but I couldn't fit them all on this slide. They are on the site to download. So, understanding the competitive advantage. We've talked about that. What is it that makes them different? And the business needs to understand what it is that makes them different. This is, oh, go back here. Oh, it's not going to do it. There we go.
Hello.
So that was stopping by the roadside in Ethiopia. And everybody there on the left was trying to sell us pineapples. Everybody on the right was trying to sell us onions. And the question is, why would I buy from one person versus the other? They're all pushing their onions or their onions or their pineapples into the car saying, buy mine, buy mine. And nobody had an advantage over the other person. We go down the road a little bit further and everybody is selling eggs because that's what they do. From a competitive advantage, nobody had an advantage. So what we tried to teach people is that if I was an onion sales person, I'd walk up the road to the pineapple people and trade my bag of onions for a bag of pineapples and come back and sell my pineapples where everybody else is selling onions. I'd have an advantage. I'd be selling something different. And this is very clean and very simple because they're both commodities. One onion is no different from the other onion. But if everybody's selling onions and I'm selling pineapple, all of a sudden I have an opportunity. I've got a competitive advantage. And that's where, they're lacking the entrepreneurship that looks at the opportunity and says, wow, I just have to walk a few miles and come back. And all of a sudden I'm the only one selling pineapple. Now, obviously there's demand for the pineapple. And we're probably sitting here waiting to buy pineapple, but everybody's just selling onions. So understanding the competitive advantage is important. And that, again, is looking at what they can do different. I'm working with a group out of Cambodia that is trying to sell dried mangoes. Everybody in the world sells dried mangoes. Not exactly, but dried mangoes are very easy to buy. But they also do a parsat onion or orange. It's an orange with a green skin. It's different, and they dry it. So I'm looking at that saying, let me sell your green orange to the US market. I don't want to sell your mango because they can get it from 50 different countries. You're the only one that can do that orange that way. So we're trying to find something different, find what the competitive advantage is. Knowing the competitive advantage, it can be land, it can be location, season, labor, technology, or capital. What is it that sets them apart? As the consultant, Your job is to try and figure out what that is and what the combination is. Sometimes we realize that it's none of them. They have no competitive advantage. Again, selling the palm oil out of Sri Lanka into the United States, I'm sorry, out of Sierra Leone to the United States is not going to happen. There is no competitive advantage. In their case, they need import substitution. They're actually importing palm oil. So why am I trying to help them find export markets? Because that's what the development industry wants them to do, increase their exports. But palm oil is not it. And they can decrease their need for capital by having a domestic crop and increasing the domestic stuff. So, knowing your competitive advantage, and you may not have one. If you don't have one, then you need to look at what else can you or should you be doing. Cost benefit analysis. There's no standard format for doing this, but in my opinion, we all do cost benefit analysis for everything we do. Everything. To getting up in the morning, you try and figure out, is it worth my time to get out of bed or do I stay in bed? What's the cost? What's the benefit? Joining this session today, you had to weigh in your mind, what is the cost of joining this session? What is the benefit? Now you took a risk because you don't know what the benefit is. So you had to balance that. So what we try to do is on every product, do a cost benefit analysis. And on every decision we make, do a cost benefit analysis. And we help the companies realize that they're making those decisions in every thought process they go through. Sometimes it's formalized. Other times it's just a natural thing. I'm sitting here and I'm getting thirsty. My cost benefit analysis, do I drink now or do I wait? I'm doing that analysis. In a production facilities, the cost benefit analysis is, do I do oranges or do I do tangerines or do I do asparagus? So you're analyzing the benefit, and that's where all these factors come into play, is to trying to determine what is your cost and what is your benefit, and how do you weigh that and how do you compare that with what your other costs and benefits are. So when you're, as a consultant, you want to establish a framework, establish something that documents it, because you're going to have to teach the business why you came to your conclusions. And if you don't have it quantified, you can't convince somebody else that you're right, or you can't argue with them when they say you're wrong. So you need to develop a format. So one of the things that we wanted to do in this course is teach you to do a business plan. And we have a business plan template that we've used several times. It's not perfect and it's not tailored for specifically what you're doing, but it is a start. And every time we start with the template, we modify it for the situation. I'm going to show a short video here that walks through the first stages. Now, this is a long form, and we're not going to cover the whole form now because we've only done the analysis. So we'll cover that here. Here's a document that we use to develop an export plan. It's a template. Obviously, you modify it to fit your particular needs, but it gives you an idea of what type of information is required. You see here we have an index to help people find what they need, and now we have comments here on the side. So start out with the executive summary. This is short and sweet. We've limited it to 250 words. Otherwise, it can go on forever and lose its value. You need to have the information, the contact information on the company. A lot of this information you can capture on the forms survey that we talk about elsewhere. But this allows you to put this into a document. It's also critical, in my opinion, to have the exporter or the company that you're working with sign a document that indicates what information they will provide you. So that when you come and ask for the information, it's not a surprise. So they're giving you information which will help you develop their business. Company profile is a profile of the company. What do they do? How long have they been in business? A little bit longer. Again, about 500 words here should be sufficient. What export activities have they had in the past? What stage of export readiness are they ready to export? Next we have here is current export activity. percentage. Is export 10% of their sales or 90% of the sales? How does it range in between there? Here we have questions about their current export products and markets. Who are they selling to? What products within their mix are they selling? What is the level of their importer? Is it a distributor? Is it an importer? Is it a broker? Is it a trader? What role do they play in the market? So who's buying it? And this is on their current activities. You will look at that to determine if making a change makes sense. Again, this is the current section. Ability to meet commercial standards. Do they have the international standards that are going to be required currently? Do they have HACCP? Do they have Global Gap? Do they have ISO 22000? Do they have BRC? Again, information like this can be captured on a electronic survey that allows them to answer at their free time and in their evenings and stuff, and then plugged into this market study and this marketing plan. Here we talk about products and product categories. And for each of their product categories, you will want to repeat this section. So in this form, we only have it once, but if they have 5 product categories, like they're doing canned product, they're doing fresh product, they're doing frozen product, or they're doing different classifications, like they're doing tomatoes, but then they also do peaches. So you'll want to have a different category for each of the products that they work with. Here we talk about HS codes, and we've talked about that elsewhere in this course, but you want to have the HS code to identify the product. Product description, so a legal description, but also a standard description. If it's a crop, and you can get the scientific name or the variety name, that's important to have here, because in some cases that's going to make the difference in its marketability. Target customers, from their perspective currently, who are their target customers? One thing that happens here in the US is companies that are successful will have a demographic profile of their target customer. They will identify their income, their family status, their education level, and their frequency of shopping. All those factors will help you identify what products fit into their mix. Current distribution and customary distribution. How are they distributing product currently? Do they have their own warehouses? Do they have their own trucks? Is this a system where people come in to pick up the product? So current distribution. Customary sales channels. Describe what's currently happening in their sales channels. This is an important section here, customer support for export requirements. How do things change? What requirements do they have internally? What people do they have internally to support the export? These next 2 categories, warranty and replacement and installation and maintenance, are not utilized in food, so you just delete them if you're working on food. User training. It's not typically utilized in food, though it is sometimes. So we have a client in Lebanon that produces a instant hummus that they're selling to chefs, and to their customers are selling it to chefs, and the chefs need to be trained on how to use that product. So if it's a new product or a new variation of a product, you'll need to address customer training, and whether that is you doing the training, or whether it is somebody else, your customer, or somebody within their network. Again, here it's parts, spare parts and replacement parts, not something you would do for food, but if you're doing non-food items, you'll need to address, are parts available from in-house? Are parts have to be ordered? Do parts have to be ordered from a distance? And if so, what is the lead time on that to meet the customer's needs? Are you going to have spare parts in the market? We have a business in our network that sells stainless steel containers out of Austria. And to meet the demand for parts, we have an inventory of parts here in the US. So the containers, typically we don't have an inventory here, but the parts we do. So that's something you need to address with your buyers. Again, if you're working with food, it's typically not an issue. This next one, available for supply for export. One of the worst things for a salesman is to sell something and have the product not be available, or have the supply not be there. So it's important to address that up front. Is there enough supply to meet the domestic demand, And if so, is there enough additional product to meet the export demand? And how do those products differ? For example, here in the United States, Washington apples. In the US, we consume a small to medium-sized apple that we consider to have the most flavor. Going into the Taiwanese market, the Chinese market, they like a very big apple. They're giving that apple as a gift, and the bigger the apple, the more love that's associated with that gift. So it works out real well because the domestic market takes small apples, the international market takes bigger apples. That's a nice fit. It's not always that nice, but we do find times where the difference in demands can easily be sorted in the pack house, or the difference in quality can be sorted to meet the market demand. So what product is available and what are the specifications of that product? Export budget. I like to do a 3 to 5 year budget, just because I hate to see situations where everybody gets excited and we start to build something and year 2 and year 3, there's no plan, there's no budget available. It does take time to develop the international markets. It's not something you open the doors today and start exporting tomorrow. It takes some time to get the customers and get the quality and get the specifications in place. So this is where you would discuss with the company what their budget is for export over the next 3 years. Are they willing to commit? And if so, what level? This is more just information export organizational structure. It helps you make sure you're reaching out to the right people, who's responsible, and how does that chain of commands work. Also, same thing with the export sales. Who's in charge of the sales? Is that going to be a different person in the future than it is now, etc. Export functions currently performed. And in the organization, is there somebody that's involved with market research, analysis and planning? Who are they and what information they've had? Sit down and discuss with them, try and figure out what information they've got that can be applied. That can also work if they're only doing the market research on the domestic market. Find out what their thought process is there and see if it applies to the exports. Export marketing and promotion is something you're going to be involved in. Who's going to be responsible for it, etc. Order taking and processing, is that handled differently? How is it handled? How do they track an order and track the bill of lading and track the payment? Is it done with a computer system or is it done manually? If it's done manually, I encourage the use of a project planning program or even an Outlook program or something else where you can put ticklers in to remind you that you need to send the bill of lading or that you should be getting paid for product. So keep track of that. Export finance and insurance. It's something that's important for a growing business to ensure their export receivables if possible. And if so, who's going to handle that? And then the last stage for where we're at right now is shipping and delivery. Who handles logistics? Is the logistics department capable of handling the shipments? Can you load the containers? Are you going to load them by hand or are they going to be pallet loaded? One thing to address as you get specifically into the product is how many cases of the product fit into a container. In most shelf stable products, you're going to weigh a container out before you cube it out, which means your weight is going to be up around 40,000 pounds or 18 metric tons. When you get to that level, most destinations will not accept anything over that because of the weight per wheel on the chassis. So you need to figure out 18,000 or 18 metric tons or 18,000 kilos and figure out, does that work? Basically, a 20-foot container has 1,000 cubic feet and can go, like I say, up to 18 metric tons. With refrigerated product, there are a few 20-foot containers for refrigerated. Most efficiently, though, it's a 40-foot container. And because of the product being loaded in most cases on pallets with air just shipped around for the refrigeration unit to work, you're going to both weigh and cube out the product. You would cube out a container, you'd want to go with a 40-foot container when you're dealing with a product that's very light and fluffy. We always say paper towels and toilet paper work well in 40-foot containers. In fact, in a lot of cases, you can have a shipment, you're cubing it out and maximizing the weight by balancing the two. So the rest of the sections, marketing strategy section will be completed after the market research is done, which will be another section. Thanks. Would you like me to wait a little bit while you translate that, or? Okay, we'll move on. Does anybody else have any comments before we move on? I think time-wise, we may have some time at the end for some questions. So I'll just continue to go through here. And then if we have time at the end, we can open it for questions. Now, this is a different model. We talked about the forms that we use. This is a Canvas business model. It's available online to use. And it's a visualization of a lot of the questions that we've already asked. Who are the partners? What are the opportunities? What are the characteristics? There are numerous schools of thought and numerous templates out there. The main core that relies throughout all of them is to review the business from top to bottom and to understand the principles that drive the business, so that when you go to develop, and like I said, the next course we'll talk about doing market research and how to find out which markets. And then of course, after that, we'll talk about how to find individual customers. But this is the foundation from which that tough stuff is built. So again, this form is on the International Digital University website. I'm going to give an example here of a company. Some of you may be familiar with Karula and Golden Fruit. For those that went to Dubai a couple of years ago, Karula was there with the CTJ project. I've worked with him and his company for a number of years through the EBRD, and we've seen significant changes, but it's because we're applying these principles. And so we'll walk through here this process as an example. We have, as you can tell from my discussions, I have dozens, if not hundreds of examples of how we apply these things. And we're limited on time and scope to cover them all. Some of them are on the website. Others are in my blog that talks about different things on how we apply these principles. And that's why at the first two courses that we had, we talked about entrepreneurship and charm dance, because those principles are what drives all the things beyond that. So we want to make sure that that's in place. And as the business consultant, you need to have a lot of those skills, and you need to look at how people apply those skills. This example that we're going to give here about Golden Fruit talks about how we applied some of the concepts. They say it was an EBRD funded project starting in 2016. We started out with, like I say, before I got there, we did a online review. We talked, we got information. When I went into the plant, I did a review, and then we sent one of our food process engineers there to do a review. That food process engineer went in and completely redesigned the factory, changed the flow. Now, when we went there, they had a HACCP certificate, but it wasn't legitimate. It wouldn't have stood up to an individual audit. So we went in and did an actual, supported them, the training that they needed to get an actual certificate. They improved their efficiencies in the plant 25 to 30%. So for any plant manager to be able to improve your production 5 and 10% is huge. They improved by 25 to 30% just because they improved the flow of their system. They improved their management style in what they're trying to do, and documented it, and really took the 30,000 foot view of their business. They improved their sales 22 to 25%. So not only are they more efficient, which means the cost of producing each product was down 25 to 30%, but their sales went up 22 to 25% as a result of applying these principles. And that was principles from the factory itself and analyzing the business and figuring out what they needed to the sales. Now, I've been with Karula to, where have I been? To the Middle East and to Japan, or to China and Japan, with Karula, helping him try and build his business on the sales side. He wasn't able to get a visa to the United States, but we were able to get his sales there. He's since I did this PowerPoint, has started selling a new packaged product, consumer-ready product into the United States, and he wouldn't have been able to do that in 2016 because he didn't meet the standards, the international standards, or the principles. So this was the factory beforehand in 2016. Now, interestingly enough, and pleasingly, the ladies are wearing masks and gloves. That was for the photo. And the reality here is, you look up at this picture here, she's not wearing gloves. In most days, they didn't do that. They didn't meet the standards. You can see here the floor is not smooth. It's, you know, a lot of room for bacteria and contamination. It had a HACCP certificate, but it would not have passed any inspection by the third-party buyer. So, you know, with the food process engineer, Olivier from our team, he came in, he looked at the factory, developed a plan, developed a structure, developed a process from the manufacturing side that made sense. While he was doing that, I was working on the business side and how to improve the business principles and the export side. This is a scale drawing, very small, of the changes in the factory, and then, you know, develop the relationship. This is Olivier here. He was actually with Karula in Russia. They were just both happened to be there at the same time, but able to sit down and talk about how to improve the production. This is the before and after, before, during, and after renovation. U.S. buyers aren't familiar with this or pleased with a hole in the floor for a bathroom, and it does not meet any international standards for sanitation. These holes and these missing tiles are, you know, any food process engineer would die looking at these. When we took the product to Japan to sell to Japan, the Japanese would not accept it because even though, again, he had the certificate, the standards were not there. So they've since worked on improving the plant. This is interesting too. The first time I was there, there was a cow within 10 feet of the product. Way big violation of HACCP. The cow had flies everywhere. There were flies landing on the dried fruit. I was told that they weren't flies, but they were butterflies, but they were flies. Since that time, the factory has been renovated. They completely redid the floors, they redid the roof, they reorganized the flow of the product. They improved the quality of work. You know, there was the workmanship in the floors to eliminate and minimize bacteria. They now follow and meet HACCP and Global GAP, or good management practices for production. And you see here the outside facilities. Before, this was just outside, it wasn't enclosed. You can see them modernizing the factory. And this is, they worked with EBRD on the financing for that. They worked with USAID for support in developing the international business. So, you know, there is aid agencies and development agencies, but the business itself also justified the changes. You can see here the modernization of the facilities. And these sales increased because we were able to then market to the global market, to the world, that their product had this HACCP certificate right here. And you can see this is the product on the US shelves. So in the US, for example, product is a buyer can buy product that's not HACCP certified, but they are taking the risk. If anybody gets sick, that business will be shut down and that business will be closed down because they're taking responsibility for the factory. They're taking the risk that the factory maintains the same standards. If the factory does maintain the standards as a problem, the buyer then has a limited liability that they can pass it on, and the insurance companies are involved. But buyers, and there are buyers in every market that will buy product that is not HACCP and Global GAP certified. When we were working with Uzbekistan on product, we found that going into Europe through Latvia and Lithuania was a easier way to get into the market than going to Germany, because their standards are more flexible and there's a lot more street markets and a lot more opportunities to sell product that doesn't meet those standards. So there are markets to get into, but your risk and your exposure and your ability to accept a good price are much lower. Buyers are not going to buy a product that doesn't meet the standards at the same price they would a product that does meet the standards. We covered this a little bit in the last session, and we'll cover it a little bit more here. And is the company ready for export? And sadly, this picture of the containers falling into the ocean and the ship here in the state of Washington, just last week we had 30 containers fall off a ship in our in the mouth to get to the container, get the ship to the port. And those containers are now floating out in the water. And the companies that own product and goods in those containers, first of all, they need to determine which containers they were and the receivables, and there will be insurance to cover that in most cases, but it's a slow process. So there is risk associated with that. And unfortunately, right now, you can say we have between 60 and 90 ships sitting at the harbor, which is delaying getting payment. For example, our product out of Austria would have been paid for in August, but we bought the container, the product delivered at place, DAP, and it still has not been delivered. So our supplier has not been paid. So he's financing it for 2 months beyond what he expected. So as the export consultant, you need to ask the company, and the company needs to be able to answer these. This is kind of the company statement. Are they willing to adapt their label and promotion materials and website to sell to a foreign market? Are they financially capable? And when you're developing your form, you can use these questions as part of the form and part of the format. Will they establish which products are to export and which products are they competitive on? Do they have the appropriate raw materials? Do they have the supplies? This is a case study that from another product that we did, and it shows how a traditional crop, we identified an opportunity of what wasn't being produced. So I'll let the video play here. I'm going to talk to you about a crop that we worked with that became one of our greatest successes, though. At the time when we first developed the work and a couple of years into it, the USAID project that we worked on reported it as a large failure in trying to develop new products. And years later, that crop is now generating about $160 million in exports for the region. The crop is quinoa, and I was brought down by a USAID project into Peru in around 2001. And in my studies and doing the SWOT analysis and trying to determine what their capabilities were and what the potential was, I met a local lady who came out, indigenous Quechua speaking native, who came out, and out of her box that she brought with her, she pulled a number of seeds, and she was looking through the seeds and talking about them. And my interpreters were interpreting what she felt about the seeds. And then she came across this one seed, and it was red, kind of mahogany color. And quinoa is a tan, very light color, kind of bland looking product. And it's a gluten-free grain that's consumed in the US at the time, was primarily consumed by celiacs, people that have gluten intolerance. So it had a market here, but it wasn't huge. When she pulled out this red quinoa, the fireworks went off in my head, because I saw the potential for this red product to sit on the dish next to a protein. And quinoa is a high protein, it's a great amino acid balance. So it's a great healthy food, but typically you'll have a steak or a seafood or some other protein, and next to it you'll have a starch product, rice or potatoes or couscous. This was a protein, and rice, potatoes, and couscous are all kind of bland in color. This was red, and I got excited about it. What I did is I returned back to the US. I understood the market. I knew US consumers and US restaurants would love to have a signature dish with a red product on their plate. So I went out and found a buyer, actually paid for the buyer to go down to Peru because we saw the opportunity, we saw the market. And he comes down, he saw the product, he got excited as well. He had not seen it, but there was not a lot of product available. It was a little over a kilo of this near extinct variety of quinoa available. So we worked with CARE and the Peace Corps and the Catholic Church and the USAID project and took that 1 kilo of seed and multiplied it. The problem that we ran into is the growers didn't want to grow it because they had no idea what the market was. They didn't have confidence in the market. They didn't know what the yields were going to be. And these were sustainable farmers. These were farmers that farmed primarily to feed their family and second to generate money. So if they planted a crop that failed, their life failed. They had a huge crisis in being able to feed their family and survive. So they were not willing to try something new without, they were risk averse. They didn't want to accept the risk. The buyer, on the other hand, saw the opportunity, but he didn't want to prepay for the whole crop because he was then accepting more risk than he was willing. So we worked out a deal where the buyer was able to front and prepay for 50% of a 72 metric ton order. The growers, for the first time in history, and this is a culture with an extended history, first time in history had a contract for production of a crop of quinoa before they planted it. They were ecstatic, they were thrilled. They planted it and multiplied it, over the years, it took some time, but like I say, in about 2017, the last statistics that I saw was that this crop generated about $150 million in export sales for that area of Peru and Bolivia. And now I can't go into a country in the world without seeing red quinoa. This is the brand that we introduced first into the US, but now there's dozens of brands, if not 100 brands globally that are buying the red quinoa, marketing as a special red quinoa. My only regret is that it took so long, but that is the nature of agriculture. It doesn't happen overnight. And the vision of being able to say, we know the markets, we know people will buy this product because we've studied the market, we know the cost, we know the consumer preferences, so we know that the opportunity is there. And I heard a story the other day and it made sense. And it says, the shade of the tree that you're underneath today is because somebody had vision to plant it years ago. Agriculture takes time, developing crops takes time. But if you know what the market is, if you know what the potential is, you have the confidence to accept the risk and go forward. We're able to blend, in this case, a buyer who was willing to take risk with a seller that was willing to take risk. And by doing that, everybody won. And everybody continues to win, not only from the red quinoa, but it helped get quinoa a global presence and known around the world. So that is an example of applying the skills that we've talked about here and the tools we've talked about here. We had to do the analysis, and there was the cost benefit analysis for the farmers. What is the cost of producing the product and the cost of them and the risk? Like I say, the risk if they failed. This was a country where there was no social support. So if they were growing a crop and it didn't have the yields and the crop failed, they would go hungry and they would die, or they would depend upon their family, which would be a burden to all. So they did the analysis to eliminate or minimize that risk. We had to convince the buyer to prepay for the crop. Now, buyers don't want to do that. Why would he prepay for the crop when he can buy commodities without having to prepay? Well, this wasn't a commodity. This was a risk. This was a new opportunity that he could make a big profit on. So he had, in the risk reward ratio, he had a lot of reward potential to take that product and develop it. Now, it took time. And that's one of the things that's discouraging about agriculture is that, the crops and the planting and the growing takes time and conditions are constantly changing. So there's risk associated, and it doesn't always fit into the time frame of development projects or the time frame of businesses. That's why we talked about earlier that it's important that you understand what the management team's objective is. What does the management team want to accomplish and how quickly? And as a consultant, you have to convince and educate the owners of what the long-term and the short-term of the efforts are. And that's what we had to do in this quinoa, is we had to address, what was the short term? The short term was that there was going to be a couple of years in waiting to get the product. Like I say, the USAID project, when it was done, their closing report said that it was a failure. The last year there, in 2016, last time I saw the numbers, it was about $160 million worth of failure. And it completely changed the culture in that region. And again, it was a situation where we didn't go in to look and see what they produced. We went in to look and see what they could produce. Now, this was a rare variety. There was no traditional market for it. It wasn't something where we could say, wow, consumers buy this much, therefore. There's another product that we developed from the Amazon basin called Sacha Inchi, which is an omega-3 seed that's very high in omega-3, 6, and 9 oils. Now, there was no traditional market for it. The product was found, produced locally and consumed minimally by the local population. But when we discovered that it was high in omega-3 oils, we understand the global market for omega-3 oils. And we were able to say, okay, we know there's a market, so let's take it to commercialization. We took it into the Japanese market a couple of years later when we had sufficient production. And it's selling well there. It sells here in some of the Whole Foods and Trader Joe's, some of the specialty markets here. It didn't reach its greatest potential because the structure of the omega-3 oils wasn't ideal. But when we got started, and even today, it still has a market demand. So looking at the statistics, which is what we'll learn how to do next session, is part of it. But more importantly, it's the vision. It's the entrepreneurial vision that takes those statistics and says, wow, we know there's a market for omega-3 oil. This is high in omega-3 oil. Therefore, even though there's no market for this product, there should be, and we're going to develop it. So the consultants, in this case, I was a consultant working on both those products. We had to convince both sides of the opportunity, and we had to be able to quantify it. Now, the exporters, the company statement, which is what we're talking about here, the companies had to say, what is my risk? What is my reward? Am I ready to accept that? Luckily for the importer, he was buying and selling traditional quinoa. So he had products that he knew he was going to make money on. So if he lost some money on the red quinoa, that was okay because he had a foundation. So when we talk about building a business, we look at what product can be the foundation. What product can you sell every day? And maybe it's a domestic market. Maybe it's export. But what product is going to be something that you sell while you're working on and developing new markets and new products? Sometimes the new market, as we say, takes longer to develop. And sometimes you don't make any money in developing that market for the first several years because of your added costs of going to trade shows or going into the market or even developing new packaging or new product for that market. So you have to understand that. So it's important to ask these questions when you're starting the consulting work. Do they have sufficient production capacity? Can they maintain quality? And on agriculture, quality changes with the weather. So that again comes back to the communications and charm dance, and that you need to educate and communicate with your customer and say, the cherries are, they got rained on yesterday, so they're going to spoil a little bit quicker. The buyer still may have it because that may be the only opportunity he has, but it's better to tell him the cherries are wet and can spoil quicker than it is for him to get the container, open it up, and realize 3 days later that he's got a short shelf life. So communication and honesty are two critical aspects. So are they willing to adapt? Are they financially sound? Can they support the export growth? And can they meet the standards? If they can't meet the standards, you're going nowhere quickly. So you need to make sure they make the standards. And ability to supply and market demand, it's crossroads. You need to make sure that you're supplying the right product for the market that the market demands. Language skills. Now, if you're traditionally selling to Russia and to Russian-speaking markets, that's great. If you go to the Middle East, you don't have to speak Arabic, you have to speak English. If you're going to France, you don't have to speak French, you have to speak English. So having that ability, somebody within your organization has to have that ability. They have to hire somebody. My product compares favorably with local and destination market competitors. If your product is already higher priced and not higher quality, if your cost of production is higher, their cost of production is high, then you don't have an opportunity. International competition is tough. All the products that are produced, the buyer is already buying from somebody. You're not the only supplier. Now, the red quinoa, for a while, the supplier was the only supplier, but after years of being the only one, others were able to enter the market and get out there. Now, we'll talk in another session about intellectual property and how if he had captured the seed and trademarked the seed and patented the seed, he would be protected on the international markets. But he didn't. He marketed it as red quinoa. We recommended that he market it as Arapa red, Arapa, because that was the lake from which it was close to. So consumers then would ask for Arapa red, not for red quinoa. He didn't do that. He went with red quinoa because the company was actually Quinoa Corporation. So it built on his name, his company name, but they could have protected themselves by changing and patenting and trademarking the variety. So does your product compare favorably with what's on the local market? Does it meet the international standards? Again, your watermelon may sell great in Uzbekistan, but it's not going to sell in Italy for multiple reasons. Variety, size, seeds, timing. Not to say that watermelon's a bad thing to sell into Europe. You can sell your watermelon up to Ukraine because the Italian product is not available yet, or you can sell it up to Latvia, Lithuania, Sweden, any of the Scandinavian countries or the Baltic countries. So understanding that and making sure that you're competitive and understanding how the freight rates and the duties and the border crossings impact your cargo is important. Maintaining consistent quality. The more you produce, the more risk there is that you will have to lower the quality. And what good produce companies do is they have 2 or 3 brands. The first brand is their first grade quality product. It's the perfect apple. It's the perfect melon, it's perfect tomato. They have a second grade, which is not perfect. It's got flaw. Maybe it's not as ripe, or it's got some sunburn, or it's overripe. There's something about it that makes it a second grade product, and they don't sell it under the same brand name. They sell it under a different brand name. And then a lot of times they'll have a third brand, which is sold at the very lowest, because in agriculture, not every tomato is the same. Now in Charm Dance and Quality, we talked about the Pringles potato chip and how every potato chip in a Pringles can is exactly the same as the one before it, after it, and the next time you buy it. That's because it's a manufactured product. Even though it's a food product, it's manufactured, it's extruded. But your cherries, your tomatoes, your mangoes are not. They're natural products, and one time they're one way and the next time they're another. We had a situation, we were selling canned corn to Japan. One year the corn, because of the weather conditions in the Midwest, the corn was very big kernels, big firm kernels. Consumers liked it. The next year, the weather conditions changed and there was more rain, so actually the kernels were smaller and not as big. The Japanese customers that we had complained that our corn was not the same quality. Well, it was, but it was different one year to the next. And at the time, I didn't realize that that was the case. So I wasn't able to warn them that what they were going to get was going to be a smaller kernel. But the consumers expected it to be the same. And from one year to the next, it's not. When we buy a product like a Dannon yogurt, and Dannon yogurt has fruit in it, the strawberry fruit in the Dannon yogurt is exactly the same every time. And exactly the same here in the United States as it is in Japan, as it is in Hong Kong, as it is in the UK. That's because they're taking the strawberries and homogenizing them. They're sending them to a company, some of the big ones are Zentis, Agrana, Doler. They're sending it to a company that will take the product and make it so that it's exactly the same one time to the next. They may add sugar, they may add acid, they may add color, but when you open your Dannon yogurt and it's got strawberry in it, it's exactly the same each time. So you can modify manufactured goods, manufactured food products so that they're consistent. But on the tomato or the strawberry going into that, one day it's got a higher Brix level, the next day it's got a lower Brix level. One day it's more mature or over ripened, and you need to make sure the customer knows that. Personal statement, and again, every business is run by individuals, and no matter how big the company is, it's still the individuals that are driving it. So the personal statements are critical, and that's what you get when you talk to the management, is what are their personal objectives or personal goals. What is it that drives them? What is it that makes them work? Completing the SWOT analysis, understanding the weaknesses. Like I say, we all have weaknesses, businesses have weaknesses. We all need to address that. You see here empty shelf spaces, and this is a great thing because this is a Trader Joe, a Whole Foods market in the US, and they could not get the product during COVID. So the shelves were empty. At that point in time, the company would have taken lower quality product to fill those shelves, because the customer coming there and getting nothing was not an option for them, but that's all they could do. So, you know, if a supplier had product and it didn't meet the standards, but they informed the buyer that that was the case, they would have taken. You can see here, there's no apples available. And apples are interesting because apples have a long shelf life if they're maintained properly. So again, the buyer would buy the product if he knew it was available and the customer was honest with them and told him what the quality was. Where do we go from here, or where are we now? And in conclusion to what we've talked about today, we understand the skills necessary to being an entrepreneur and business leader. We learned those with Charm Dance and entrepreneurship studies. We understand the tools of SWOT, OODA, and T-charts, and there are others out there. Use what works for you. We understand that reviewing the business, you need to look at all aspects of the business, not just the exports. You know, if there's somebody else that's looked at the domestic side or the production side, that's great, but you need to understand it. You need to understand all aspects of the importance of the business. You know, and a lot of times that's accounting, logistics, manufacturing. It's everybody. So when you do your on-site inspection, don't just look at how they're loading export containers or what they're doing on the export side, but understand the other aspects of the business. Know the parameters of the business and how they want to expand from the future. Next, what we do next, we explore the markets. We look at different tools on doing market research. Like I said earlier, back in the 1990s, when I started this business, you had to physically go to the markets to understand what was there. Now I can sit here in Seattle and I can tell you what's for sale in Tokyo or Dubai or Paris. I can tell you specific brands and size, and in a lot of cases, price. I can also use general data that's out there to get the general trends. So we'll talk about what's available out there and how to dig further. We won't talk next time about finding specific customers. That's another session. We'll talk about how to identify which markets. So we'll also develop the value chain and how to make sure that the product going to the export side is there. So this is my last slide, and we have some time remaining. So I'd be more than happy to answer questions and provide feedback. So if anybody has, I'm sure that there's going to be some input and questions and
Jim, I have a question.
sure.
How important is it to develop an export plan? So in my experience, some of the companies that I work with, they don't do that at all. They just, they find someone overseas, through their own contacts. They send them the price list, the some samples, and if the buyer likes it, they just order a container or two, and that's how they close the deal. So
Yeah, that's what we call spot business, where it's not contracted in advance and they may buy this year but not next year. A lot of times companies will work with diaspora. They'll work with their family overseas, or their friends families to get things started. And that's fine. It moves product and helps them educate themselves. One of the companies we worked with from your region, when I first started working with them, they were what's called red marked or red balled from US Customs, because they were selling to a diaspora in the US market. He didn't care if it was certified. He didn't understand the labeling laws. And they shipped product into the US that was not labeled properly. US Customs found it and banned them from exporting to the US until that problem was solved. And it took me about 6 months to solve the problem. And that's because they came into the market without knowing what they were doing. They didn't have a plan. They worked with somebody that they knew and somebody they felt comfortable with and sold to them, but that individual didn't do things right and really created more problems for them. So having a plan, like I said earlier, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Having a plan allows you to make sure that you have those questions. Like in this case, it was a label issue. It wasn't a production issue, but the label was illegal and it was caught, and it created problems for them. We were able to get it cleared, but like I say, it took a lot of time. They could have avoided that if they had a plan. And so if you're going to sell spot, if you're going to sell, you have a surplus of watermelons, you need to sell it, and you can sell it up into Latvia, and you can sell this one, but next year you may not have any, or next week. That's fine. You can do that. But if you're going to sell to CAR for all the Metro or any of the big retailers or any of the big food service chains or food manufacturers, you can't do that on a spot basis. There are trade shows like Fruit Logistica and Gulf Foods and World of Produce, where buyers go and they make their commitment for the next year. They will tell the manufacturer, I need 5 containers a week of this product, or the producer. The producer may say, I can get you 2. Okay, then they take 2 there, and then they look for somebody else to fill the other 3. But they want programmatic business. They want so many containers for such a long period of time, whenever the harvest is. Sometimes they pick just the middle of the harvest or the beginning of the harvest, and depending on what their needs are, but they want consistent business, and that's not done without a plan. And the other thing on a plan is, and maybe this is something we can talk about in value chain, is contract farming. Years ago with Uzbekistan, we went into Europe, and some of the European buyers said, great, you produce great melons. I want you to produce this melon. I can send my technical people there to teach you how to produce it and produce it with this seed. So then the producers would be producing specifically to meet the buyer's needs. So their contract production, they're like what we did in Peru, they're planting, getting either paid or at least a contract before they plant the crop. They produce a product specifically for a buyer. That's much more dependable than hoping you can sell it on a spot basis. Now, plans don't, having a formal, 100-page business plan that isn't necessary. I had one of my best bosses wrote the business plan on the back of a napkin. we sat at the lunchtime and we talked about it, and we'd already done our reviews, and he wrote down on the back of the napkin what our strategy was. I had another boss who wrote a 300-page business plan that had charts and graphs and diagrams and everything else. He wasn't any more successful than the guy who did it on the back of the napkin, but they both had a plan, and they both had done the practices and the principles of charm dance. They both had done the SWOT analysis. And as I say, a lot of the analysis that we do naturally. We're doing it, the risk analysis, the cost benefit analysis, we do it for everything. It's important that you do it when you're a consultant, that you sit down with the business and you do it with them, and you get them to buy in, to own the decisions, to take ownership and feel that that's their plan. Because again, if they have a plan, they'll be able to execute it. So there's, if you're just a trader and, you've got great domestic business and occasionally you have surplus product to sell, then yeah, you can do it without a plan. But if you want to be in the long-term success of the business, you need to have a plan. You need to know where you're going. You need to develop the relationships. It's funny, we introduced a US buyer to an Egyptian exporter. The exporter had a container of product that was sitting in the US that was rejected by his customer in Colombia, I believe it was. So they moved it to the US and he tried to sell it. The buyer here that we introduced him to couldn't buy it because it wasn't treated properly for the US market, for his market. And so we told the seller to stay in touch with them, to continue to offer him product, to continue to update him on crop conditions and prices, because the next time he's ready to buy, that relationship has to be there. And again, that's the charm dance principle of keeping the dialogue and communications going. Even though you don't sell something now, you begin to develop the friendship. I had customers in Japan that for years, every month I would send them a crop update. And a crop update would let them know what the harvest was and the yield was and the weather conditions. And for 3 years, several of them didn't buy from us. On the fourth year, when their other supplier made a mistake or their other supplier didn't raise his price, then we were able to supply. You have to remember, everything you're selling, unless you're doing a square watermelon, everything you're selling, somebody else is already selling to them. So that other supplier has to make a mistake for you to get in. And like in the situation in Dubai, where the buyer wanted a container a week, they were ready to close the deal, but the exporter didn't necessarily follow up. So because they didn't have a plan, because they didn't look at the long term. So plan's important. And sometimes the plan is 3 years, sometimes it's 5 years, and sometimes it's 3 months. It depends on the needs of the business. But for agriculture and for developing a consistent export business, it's got to be a 2 or 3 year plan, at least on what you're trying to accomplish, what events you're going to attend, what your marketing materials are going to be, what products you're going to plant, etc.
Awesome, thank you. And just one more thing. Most Turkmen companies, when they try to export their products, they want cash in advance before they send their containers. And none of them are willing to sell on account, basically extending the credit for 30 or 60 days, as it is common in other countries. So could you tell us about that? How common is cash in advance in international trade?
Well, if you were the only supplier of a product, I'd pay you cash in advance. But if I can buy the product from somebody else that I don't have to pay cash in advance, I'll buy it from somebody else. So if you're selling, and the bigger I am, the less likely I am to pay cash in advance, because if I'm Carrefour or Aldi or somebody that has good credit and good financials, I don't need to pay cash in advance, because everybody is beating a path to my door to sell to me and will give me the terms that I, as the buyer, can dictate to them. So cash in advance really limits your customer base, because the big guys aren't going to do it. That's too much of a risk. They don't have to take the risk. They're risk averse. The small guys, we say the fly by night, but the jobbers and the guys that are going to buy spot, they may be willing to pay cash in advance, but they're not going to pay as much as somebody who's going to, to buy the product on payment terms. As a buyer, I don't think I've ever paid for anything in advance. I may open a letter of credit, so the customer's guarantee or the supplier's guaranteed getting payment. But if you have the only blue apple in the world, then you can sell it on cash in advance. But if you're trying to sell an apple that's the same as somebody else's apple, why would I buy from you? I'll buy from the one that gives me the best terms. And the bigger I am, the bigger terms I get. Now, to avoid risk, and it's something I wanted to talk to you about, is most countries have available risk or receivable insurance that allows you to insure your receivables. And it's available on the international marketplace, where you sell to a customer and the insurance company undertakes the risk that company is going to pay. And it requires documentation that you made the shipment and everything else, but receivable insurance is possible. If you need cash in advance, there's very little incentive to pay you the same as I'd pay anybody else. And if I can buy it from somebody else, why would I take the risk, particularly in a country that may tomorrow restrict exports of a product? We saw that in Uzbekistan when the prior president changed the rules overnight, and all of a sudden everything had to go by rail. If I had already prepaid for a crop going out or product going out of there, I'd be stuck. So buyers are reluctant to buy from new suppliers. Now, once a relationship is established, then they're more likely to pay cash in advance because they have confidence that you're going to ship. But if I pay you and you don't ship, what am I going to do? I'm not going to go to Turkmenistan. I know how tough it is to get in there. I'm not going to go to Turkmenistan and try and collect my money from you. So you need to figure out a way that you can do it without requiring cash in advance.
And what are your recommendations? What are your recommendations, particularly for Turkmen companies that want cash in advance? What alternatives do they have?
Well, the only thing I can say there is look at getting international receivable insurance. Find the ability to insure your receivable, or if you're selling to Carrefour, for example, or a reliable buyer, your risk is minimal. These big guys are not going to not pay a supplier. That would hurt their business several fold. They don't want to take that hit on their reputation. So the bigger the company is, the more likely they are to pay you, but the less likely they are to pay cash in advance. Now, we were able to negotiate for the cherries that went out of Uzbekistan to Dubai 100% prepayment. And what happened there? The supplier shipped a bad product, and when the buyer came back with a claim, the supplier disappeared. Now, unfortunately, that hurts everybody that tries to sell that customer again. Now, we were able to use our good reputation to say, trust us, trust this supplier. And then the supplier didn't supply the right product. If the supplier would have responded with, yes, we made a mistake, which was documented. Yes, we made it with pictures and the temperature recorder on the container. Yes, we made a mistake and we will honor your claim for $1,000. That would be a step in the right direction. In this case, the supplier said, I only made $3,000 on it. Why would I give you $1,000? Well, they're never going to be able to sell to that customer or anybody else in that market again. So the only solution is to get either figure out a way to accept payment on cash against documents, net 30 days. We'll talk about this in the pricing structure. There are three for produce. There are three ways to price your product: fixed price, price guarantee, and minimum price guarantee. And consignment, actually, four. And we'll talk about that and what each one of those means. But you notice none of those were cash in advance. And the world is too close and there's too competitive. And unless you have something unique, and I haven't seen it out of Turkmenistan, why would I pay you cash in advance when I don't have to pay Turkey or Egypt or Italy cash in advance?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Thanks for also showing the document, the export strategy plan. And just a reminder to everyone that that's downloadable from the IDU platform. Very good document. I like the structure of it very much. I liked your comments on the margins. So yeah, a very good place to start for building a plan. And the unnecessary sections can be removed. The
Right.
others give you good guidance in terms of what issues should be addressed in advance. Yeah, thank you for developing that.
Yeah, it's something we've used before, and it's we do tailor it to each company or each group that we're working with so that it fits their needs. But it's a template. It's a start.
Yep.
Any other questions or comments? Well, our next session, like I say, is on market research. It talks about the various tools that are out there, and it scratches the surface. There's more tools than I could talk about in a month. We have some videos that actually work you through it, some of the different tools that are there, and it tells you how to analyze them. It's interesting in what we do. There is an art and there is a science. The science can be taught. I can show you, here's the website. That's the science, going to the website and doing the research. The art is, how do I take that information and convert it to a plan? And that can't be taught. It's kind of like we can all sing, but we're not all singers. Doesn't mean I can sing, but it doesn't mean it's good. And so the skill that an entrepreneur has is the ability to take that data that we're going to see next time and convert it to a plan. And we'll give you the tools to do that with, but that's something you're going to have to figure out how to apply that. And it's funny because you can. There's a number of courses internationally on entrepreneurship and how to teach people the skills, but I'm a firm believer that it's genetic. Is that if you're an entrepreneur, you've got a different composition, DNA composition, to look at those numbers and say, oh, there's an opportunity here. I mean, we see that with the Amazon, with Bezos and Tesla and all these great entrepreneurs, is that we all had the information at our fingertips. It was all available to us, just that they did something with it. They took the information and applied it. So the next session we'll talk about, here's the science behind it. And throughout the course, we'll talk about some of the skills for the art, to take it from the science to the application and actually making it happen.
Well, thank you, Jim, for today's presentation, and we look forward to the next one on marketing plan.
Okay, I look forward to your input, and hopefully everybody will go on to the site. Tomorrow, when I get up, I will find the links for the YouTube videos to go on to show you how to use the university's website to navigate through that, because the materials are there. We encourage you to take a look at them and to apply them. I thank everybody for their time, and I will see you in a few days.
Okay, yeah, see you next time. Have a good night. Thanks for staying up late again.
That's all right. I have a call in 10 minutes with Lebanon, so.
The life of a consultant. Okay, take care.
I always say sleep is for somebody else, I guess, so. All right, thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night, bye.